Gumba Malgan Gumba Nini Gia Nindu. So good evening, and it's great to see you here. And that's a welcome from Barragum language, which is the community that I grew up on the Darling Downs. Good evening, my name is Vicky McDonald, and it's my great privilege to be the State Librarian and CEO of your State Library, the State Library of Queensland. And it's certainly my pleasure on behalf of my colleagues to welcome you to this evening's Portrait of an Artist event with Lawrence Daws. But let me begin by also acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The State Library of Queensland is located on Kirrilpa Point, which is a traditional meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we proudly continue that tradition today and every day of the year. I'd also like to welcome and acknowledge James C Sourris AM and his sister Marika, Lawrence Daws and his wife Andre, welcome. Marek Kalkowicz, a member of the Library Board of Queensland, our President of the Queensland Library Foundation Council, Helen Brodie, Chris Saines, Director of QAGOMA, who will be leading tonight's Q&A session, Philip Bacon, Bettina Macaulay, and Bettina is conducted the Portrait of an Artist interview that you'll be watching this evening. Also, donors and supporters of the State Library, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, it's fantastic to have you here with us this evening. It's terrific that so many of you are here tonight to learn more about an artist who will certainly appreciate the magnificent jacaranda trees that are blooming throughout Queensland today. This is our third Portrait of an Artist event for 2018, and the series brings to life the James C Sourris AM collection of contemporary Australian artist interviews. It is part of the Australian Library of Art collection, which is held here at State Library and is available online for everyone, everywhere in the world to enjoy. These oral history interviews are conducted in the studios of the artists, where they reflect on what has shaped and influenced their work, and they provide unique and significant insights into each of the artists' practice. The collection is of enormous interest and benefit to art lovers, researchers, historians and students, and helps to promote Queensland stories and achievements to the world. As custodians of Queensland's memory, the State Library embraces and nurtures storytelling, knowledge and creativity. We hope that tonight's screening and Q&A session will inspire a sense of creativity possibility in your own life. Lawrence Daws has enjoyed a long and successful career as a painter and printmaker. And during a career spanning 60 years, he has explored the Australian landscape with a unique sense of beauty and foreboding. After a childhood spent in South Australia, Lawrence attended the National Gallery School in Melbourne and first came to the public attention in the early 1950s. He was awarded a scholarship to study in Italy in the late 50s and went on to live in London, where he infused his art with his exploration of philosophy and literature. His interest in Carl Jung, the collective unconscious, and a man's inability to handle freedom has also helped inform his art. Lawrence was an early adopter of technology and is believed to be one of the first Australian painters to experiment with computer-generated prints. His work speaks of self-discovery and regeneration and appears in galleries and museums around the world. The Supreme Court of Queensland also showcases a mural by this distinguished artist. If you search the State Library's catalogue, you will also find a large selection of books detailing and analysing his career. Lawrence has also received honorary doctorates from both the Griffith University and the University of Sunshine Coast. So we are indeed fortunate to have the opportunity to learn more about the practice and inner world of Lawrence Daws this evening. First up this evening, you'll see a screening of the interview between Lawrence and Bettina Macaulay. And this will be followed by a Q&A session led by Chris Saines, Director of QAGOMA. So Chris's participation tonight certainly demonstrates the strong collaboration here in the Cultural Centre between all the cultural institutions. If you are joining the conversation on social media tonight, don't forget to use the hashtag SLQPortrait. And don't forget to go online afterwards and discover more stories in this very fascinating series. So thank you for coming along this evening. I hope you enjoyed this screening, and then we'll have the Q&A session. Thank you.
Lawrence, welcome very much to the filming. It's kind of you to...
I'm quite looking forward to it.
Thank you. In your early life in South Australia, how did you first become interested in art? Were any family members especially interested in visual art, or did you have formative contacts with artists and art galleries?
When I was quite young, my father was a builder, and he used to get a magazine called Great Paintings of the World. It's got a small, but decent format, and it always included one colour reproduction in it on grained paper, which he would pin up around the house. So I became interested in, or visually aware of, Corot and Velázquez and people when I was about 14.
So you had your own in-house gallery?
Sort of, yes. But I was studying, soon after that I started studying engineering and architecture. And that took me to the library in particular. And I started looking at art books in the library because the art gallery was right next door to the library in Adelaide. And I got very fascinated by the paintings and drawings of Hesse, Hans Hesse in particular. I thought I'd have a go at painting when I was about 16. I bought a small little watercolour tin outfit and took myself up to the hills. We lived at the foothills of Glen Osmond, which is only 4 miles from the GPO there, but it was country, and started painting. So from that moment on, I became interested in watercolours. And as I grew a few years older, at 16, 18, 17, I had a motorbike and I'd drive up to Harndorf for the weekend and paint.
See all the Hessens.
Watercolour. And that's when I met up with Heisen, and he became a mentor. He was such a generous guy. And I'd go out to the Cedars at the end of the weekend on Sunday and show him the work I'd been doing, and he'd criticise it and things like that.
Was his criticism helpful? Was his criticism
Indeed
helpful?
It was. Things like treat the shadow as a mass, not just individual little bits of shadow, things like that. Which, and it was he actually who, my father went up to see him, and he convinced my father that I might make a go of it, and that I should go to the National Gallery in Melbourne, which I did at the age of 21, and studied there for 4 years under Dagi. And Dagi, of course, is very strong on tone, so Heisen's words came through very quickly.
How did you find the difference between Dagi and Heisen? What sort of their approaches?
Well, in drawing, for one thing, they're very similar. At the National Gallery School in Melbourne, you had to do 1 year in the drawing in the old cast room. You're painting, drawing heads of Voltaire, and copies, all plastic copies of great sculptures and so on. Fortunately, I was lifted out of there after 6 months, but some people stayed there for a year. So in that sense, they're very similar.
A number of Australian artists have explored philosophy, literature and psychology, but your interest in these areas is particularly deep and lifelong. It's a remarkable intellectual core informing your work, and sustained and developed over a career spanning 60 years. How did these cultural interests affect your responses to the numinous in art?
All of that evolved very gradually. Let's see how it happened. At the age of 30, I won a scholarship to Italy for 2 years, the Flato Lara Dante Alighieri scholarship. But I've become aware of what was happening in America and so on. Pollock and Rothko were active at that time. And I went on to London after the 2 years in Italy, and I was there virtually for another 10 years. And soon after I arrived in London, I started reading a simple book about Jung, and it really got me fired up quite a bit. And I then proceeded to get bigger and better books on Jung, his complete works and all that sort of stuff. And it fascinated me, the collective unconscious idea that we all have deep down a similar feeling about certain things. You mention a king, and everyone thinks of a king visually. in a particular way, from childhood almost, or the hanged man, or the idiot, or and so on. There were 21 major images in the so-called Arcana that he based some of his stuff on. But I like the idea of the unconscious part of one's being.
And it comes back to that comment that you made about Hermann Hesse's view that...
No, Hermann Hesse, that came later, but it did. Hermann Hesse's classic statement that I've cut out and pinned on my notebook was, the true profession of man is to find his way to himself. And I thought that was fantastic. Anyway, I got into the Jung thing, but the unconscious side of Jung's theory fascinated me, that there's a part probably below the navel, in the deep unconscious part of one's body. It's not head stuff at all. And that images started coming out after that. The mandala paintings came out quite accidentally. I was working in the studio over the bread shop in Hampstead High Street, and I had these large canvases, and I started working on it in red and so on. And then I decided just to scrape a shape in the top, and I got very excited by the image that came out. And it was at that very time I just started reading this thin paperback, almost of Jung, and I'd completed 2 or 3 of these works, and I realised from what Jung was talking about that it was a mandala. A mandala in Jungian terms could be anything. It can be a square, it can be something, a garden in a particular shape, it can even be a dance of some sort, formal dance in a square. And the concept is that it makes one feel whole and complete. You just experience it, and it's very satisfying, makes one feel quite whole. So I got pretty excited by that. So there were about six paintings of them in the mandala series. But then I was showing my first wife Australia, and we got a car in Adelaide and drove up all around the place, stopping at various Cooperpedy and Tennant Creek mining towns, finishing up in Queensland in Anarchy, a place of sapphire mines. And I met an old man there called Joe Shanahan, and he was fascinating. He became a subject matter for a great number of my paintings. He's tell me stories and so on about his life, and he and his friend, they were both writing their memoirs at the time. But I'd catch sight of him in a hole about 3 feet deep in an old riverbed, digging away, and it was like a death and a rebirth. It just, he could have been digging his own grave, or he's re-emerging from the womb almost, having a rebirth, and he was about 80 at the time. So there are a lot of mining paintings came out of that.
Just coming back to when you were in London, was that where you first met Brett Whiteley in London?
It was indeed, yes. As I say earlier, I had a studio over the ABC, a bread shop in Hampstead High Street, right up near the Hampstead Tube Station. And Arthur and I had been friends, Arthur Boyd and I had been friends for a while at that time. And Arthur was going to bring Brett over to meet me. So they were due about 2 o'clock. And I was on the first floor, looking down. I saw this taxi arrive, and this young man with orange hair, looking like Harpo Marx, leapt out and took hold of Arthur's arm and helped him out. And they came up, and there was Brett jumping around, talking about his heroes and me. He just had a year in Italy. And he's talking about Piero and the Americans. He's talking about, who's he talking about? He had first names for everybody. Francis, of course, Francis Bacon. Meanwhile, Arthur's almost complaining. He said, "Do you know, he helped me out like an old man." And Arthur was only 40 at the time. And he was quite fit and well. Anyway, but that was the first meeting with Brett. And then we moved over to Ladbroke Grove. They all had, well, he and Mick Johnson and Michael Johnson had studios there, and I took over one of them eventually. But we hung around together as a group all the time. We went drinking together and went to all the exhibitions together. And there was a big exhibition of Australian art set up by Brian Robertson at the Whitechapel Gallery, and quite a few of the Australians were there. And he made a big change to our lives. He chose, we were all in the exhibition, of course, and he chose Charlie Blackman, Brett, and me to represent Australia in the Under 35 Biennale in Paris, which was quite a significant exhibition for the Under 35, because all the dealers from Europe came there to sniff out potential people that they might take on. And two people, John Singh and his partner, came over from the Matisse Gallery in London and immediately signed up Brett, Charlie and me for our first one-man shows in London.
You were one of Australia's first computer literate artists, producing computer-generated prints. How did that interest in the computer as an art form for making art come about?
Let's see. I must have seen a computer somewhere, maybe out of Griffith University. I'd been on their Works of Art committee ever since they started. And there was a guy, Richard Blundell, there who knew all about graphics and things. And we were using the etching workshop. They had set up an etching workshop, which was a community access workshop. Anyone could go and do etchings there. So I took advantage of it, and I went out there and did 29 etchings, I think. And I gave a copy of every one as a gift to the Griffith University. But I loved it. It was fantastic. I'd go out every week for a day or two. Anyway, I think I saw a computer there somewhere, pretty primitive one. So I went off and bought myself an Amiga that had a memory of 1.4 megabytes, 1.5 megabyte, and printed in high resolution was 496 colours, I think. Anyway, I was fascinated by it and bought one and started teaching myself how to use it. And I had to go way up to Bundamba whenever something went wrong. But I loved it. And it had a simple form of Windows that later became very fashionable and usable. And I learned how to get a black and white movie camera to take stills and transfer them into the computer. So that was back in 1986. That's a long time ago, about 30 years ago, isn't it?
Oh, yes, and no one was doing it at the time.
And then I went from there on, but strength to strength with that. I became really fascinated. And to this day, I now use a computer more than I paint, in the sense that I resolve images on the computer. It can take ages. There's a printout here in the hallway here called The Cage. It would have taken me months and months of actual work, spread over a couple of years to do it on the computer. There's no photograph or anything, it's just all literally done on the computer. And now I work out paintings, composition and colour, and it's a delightful thing because you can lift things, shrink them, enlarge them, move them, bing, bing, all over. What would have taken me a week of doing little pencil studies, I could do in half an hour on the computer. Dealers hate it. They love coming into a studio, seeing these little pencil drawings lying around on the floor, scooping them out, putting them in gold frames and all that. But there's none of that now. So anyway, but it takes me many hours and days to work out an image or two to get it right, you know.
But it's still something that you find useful in,
Oh, yeah,
like another.
yes,
It's another
certainly
brush in a way.
Yeah.
Brush of the imagination.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Themes to do with anxiety, freedom, regeneration occur in many of your works from the 1980s. Did you regard this as a necessary process to arrive at a state of calm?
They probably were, but I didn't recognise them as such. Let's see. Man's inability to handle freedom is a fact. They behave like lemmings, you know. They all join the same golf club and behave the same way and dress the same way and so on. Or they do something else the same way and so on. As Kafka, I guess, that triggered that, the idea of lack of inability to handle freedom. So the cage and the running figures has a great deal to do with that. And there were a few straight running figure paintings, quite large, 8 feet by 6 or something. But
some of them literally seem to have thousands of figures running.
I didn't actually count them, but there would have been 6,000 or 7,000 figures running in them. But so that was basically the Kafkaesque nightmare of things.
I think the end papers to the 1982 book feature one of those massive running figures.
Yeah, it did, exactly. Yeah, that's reproduced quite a bit somewhere. But as for the personal anxiety, I don't know. I didn't think that I was anxious at that time. I didn't think I was getting any anxiety therapeutically out of me.
More relates to the state of the world.
Yeah, I think it was. I did a series of paintings called domestic violence, and they were very much to do with the state of the world. There's one, I saw a photograph of Scotland, a man, his mother's sitting on a sofa, and he's standing behind her with his hand on the shoulder, and then there's a fire going in the corner, a fireplace burning away. It looked so cosy. So I had to put a large window in the background, and I had, what was he doing? The mother wasn't there. He was standing there with his hand on a zebra, which was being ripped to pieces underneath by a lion. And in the background there was the painting image in the background was a little red boat going out. It was the icebreakers that used to take the people who used to go out and club young seals to death and things like that. So what I was trying to get across was there's a massacre on a global scale, and that led in, well, that was part of the promised land. It wasn't just about one brother killing a brother. It was about a whole race of people killing races of people, whole tribes and so on. So there are four domestic violence paintings, and they were all about our inability to behave properly, I think.
You've said that getting mountains going on canvas and in your head is deeply satisfying. Why has that been so sustaining and fulfilling?
I don't know. I just love painting mountains. Some of the first drawings I did after I picked up that watercolour thing at 16, there were quarries. There were quarries near where I lived. Beautiful old quarries. And I draw them quite a bit, and I found that deeply satisfying. What else? And then I went to the Flinders Ranges, drawing because of course Hesse had been up there drawing, so I had to go on my motorbike drawing the Flinders Range. They've got spectacularly beautiful in that early morning light. And ever since then, I've about 8 to 10 years ago, I went down to South Australia, which is where I grew up originally, but left it when I was 20. I returned to Port Wollonga, which is 3/4 of an hour south of Adelaide, on the coast, in the middle of a very good wine-growing district, McLaren Vale. And threading through it is the most beautiful range of hills called the Fleurieu Peninsula. And they are quite spectacular. I immediately went out for the first time for a long time doing plein air painting, sitting down with a hat in the sun, 20 or 30 little paintings and so on. And they soon became, I did a lot of photographing. I'd go out very early in the morning, late in the evening, when that raking light would come in. They were spectacular. And then started work on some big paintings. And they dominated my imagery for the next 5 years, I suppose.
It's interesting that the Fleurieu Peninsula has influenced a lot of poets as well.
Have they?
Yeah.
It certainly influenced a lot of painters, I know. Which painters? I don't know. I have to look that up. I don't know the
Yes,
poets.
there's some who've been
I'm not
influenced
surprised
by that. And of course, your interest in mountains, I mean, the glass houses.
Oh, well, they dominated. I was living there for about 35 years, looking out at them. And Brett Bartley used to come up there and paint all the time. He loved them. He drew and painted them non-stop, and they were beautiful. And I just couldn't not paint them. They were there sitting right in front of us. And they became, I did convert them into other things. They weren't all just landscapes with mountains in them. They were often subjected into the background and something else was going on.
By the end of the 1990s, you've said that you were approaching the stillness and simplicity that you'd searched for in your life and work. Did this assessment come with any caveats for your work?
Well, I started painting some water lily paintings, just a few at that time, not a lot, but just a few, and they were deeply satisfying. There's a tranquility about them that seemed to settle things down a bit. I guess there's not too much dark stuff coming up from the inside, like there was earlier on. It could just be an age thing, or it could be that I've finally found a slightly peaceful state of being. But I think the last seriously threatening painting was the Trojan horse, quite a large thing with running figures underneath them. So the rest have been the Fleurieu Peninsula, which I love, Poinciana trees, the lovely red of Poinciana trees against the mountains and so on. They are soothing, if not to me.
Now, over the years, you've done a number of portraits, which of course are quite different from your other work. What inspires you to do those?
Oh, it's quite simple, actually. In 1980, I had to study portraiture under Dargy. We had to do portraits, the whole thing. But in fact, I'd never painted it before. I painted my mother when I was soon after art school. But I'd never actually tackled portrait. But somebody asked me if I'd do a commission in 1980 of a portrait. He was head of the, what is now QUT. I said, sure, so away we went. And painters never have an absolute guarantee of money, you know. So I thought I'll do one portrait a year, which will pay my framing bills and all that sort of stuff. Which I did, and they kept inviting me to do portraits, and I'd just do one. They were invariably chancellors and vice-chancellors of universities, Griffith and Queensland Uni, and the Sunshine Coast University. Now, they're not works of art in that sense, in the sense of things. They are technically what I learned under Dargy. They're competent, they're good-looking portraits. End of story.
And they show a particular person
Yeah.
in a way that's different from a photograph, of course.
Yeah, you really try and capture something about the person, but there's nothing Jungian or any of that stuff going on there, I can tell you.
Do you have any currently favourite topics?
Topics?
Or categories or subjects?
Well, I can tell you what. We were in England 2 years ago for a while, and we went to see the Turner, late Turners they're called, late Turners, and they're blazing gold, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. And I got to thinking about the Glasshouse Mountains, because they get a beautiful gold glow at a certain time. And then I thought about the late Lloyd Rees paintings, and they were not the detail that he threw in all. They were almost abstractly vague, just a hint of something showing through. So I then thought the late Lawrence Daws paintings, you know. And there's a vet in Landsborough who took me up in a plane he built himself, and it had a thing on it. You had to have a stapled on the side. This is not authorised to carry passengers. Anyway, he's going to take me up to Fraser Island, but we took off, and there was a mist came down. We couldn't get, so we came back and went all over the Glasshouse Mountains, and I took the most amazing photographs of the mountains from up there. And then I tumbled, after seeing the Turner, that these would be all gold, the late works of Lawrence Daws. That is where I'm heading. I just have to live long enough to pull it off.
Do you feel there've been some particular exhibitions that you felt were especially important over the years?
Probably, yes. There was a retrospective in South Australia when I was relatively young at the South Australian Art Gallery in 1966 of all the work, much of the work I'd done to that point. I had a major retrospective exhibition in the Brisbane City Hall Gallery in 1980, would it be?
80, 82?
Yeah. That included a great deal of what I'd call more serious work. As for highlights of a career, I never think of my life as a career. People say, you know, the highlights of this or that. It's just unfolded somehow.
It's what you do.
And that's the way it goes. But you collect things on the way. I got an honorary doctorate from Griffith University and one from the Sunshine Coast University. And a touring exhibition that you put together, actually.
The
you
Promised
and Desmond
Land
put together.
from...
That toured largely many places in Queensland and in New South Wales. That was a particular highlight for me. Because you get these images down, and people, particularly if they're sold, you have a successful exhibition, they're in the gallery, people come and see them, they're sold, zip, they're gone. Nobody knows about them unless they're published in a book or things like that.
I think it's important when there is an exhibition, particularly in a public gallery, that there's a catalogue as well, which there was with the Promised Land, because it stays afterwards. You can go back and look at the works.
Yeah. Anyway, probably the most exciting thing that's happened to me is when I married Andre 3 years ago. It's all come together somehow. It's perfect.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for talking today about your life and art, and it's been such a career of great artworks. It's wonderful to hear something about the background of what inspired some of them.
Thank you. But you helped me unravel some things that just sit there for a long time unravelled.
Thank you.
good evening. As Vicky mentioned, I'm Chris Saines, Director of the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to speak a little further with Lawrence this evening, to draw some of the threads of that wonderful conversation that he had with Bettina out a little further. The conversation was filmed, I think, a couple of years ago in 2016. And so that journey toward the late paintings is continuing well, Lawrence. So I hope I can invite you now to step up onto the stage and join me, and we'll take that journey a little further. Thank you. Also, just while you're getting settled, to acknowledge James C Sourris as well for the wonderful work that he's done in support of these oral histories on artists. And if you look at the list of artists on the screen behind me, it's and others involved in the art world more broadly, it's wonderful to have an archive like this. Can you imagine in 30, 50 years' time how valuable that will be to hear the voice of the artist? I think when Vicky was making her introductory comment, she said that the artists were all interviewed in their studios. Well, I think it's a very fine studio, first of all, that you have, Lawrence. But it will be a terrific legacy, I think, that's going to be left for the scholars and researchers and art-interested collectors and others into the future. So, Lawrence, first of all, welcome. It was a very enjoyable conversation with Bettina. And as I said, I wanted to draw a few further threads out from that. One of them was early on, you talked about, I think about age 16, buying a tin of watercolours. And that was, for you, the beginning of becoming interested in art as a young man. What really sparked that interest? And have you any memories of what it was like when you first discovered the power of the pencil or the watercolour brush, how it felt to be beginning to make images?
Well, it probably started in the library, and I'd find art books there, particularly on Heisen's work, and his drawing was fantastic.
Yeah.
But I was studying engineering and architecture, and I was doing drawings of buildings and things like that.
Yeah.
But not art, it's just perspective drawings and things. But when I bought the little tin of watercolour with little pans of watercolour in, and took myself up to the hills behind where we lived, there's a nice sense of freedom about doing something for the first time that I'd been thinking about, and it did lead on to more watercolours, more exotic places to paint, mainly Harndorf, and where I, of course, met up with Heisen, who became a mentor and very influential in my life.
And was drawing something that came very effortlessly to you? Were you one of those dreadful, precocious children that somehow pick up a pencil and it's all there, or did you really have to work hard to build those first skills?
It actually came through the architectural side of things.
Right.
In that the buildings and in Harndorf, there are old barns and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Drawing those was very easy. They're in a slightly architectural way.
Yeah.
Real drawing came much later. But after art school, we learned about tone and things. But they were the introduction to the art world as I imagined it to be.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that those first two guides on your journey into art, less formally perhaps Heisen at the beginning and more formally with Dargy at the National Gallery School, both of them were of a generation that truly understood the power of drawing as a kind of solid architecture for building a painting. And it was, in Heisen's case, it was very much a traditional way of building a composition. And we recently acquired a beautiful watercolour of Heisen's that your talk with Bettina reminded me of. It's a small quarry scene. Absolutely beautiful command, both of the pencil and of the brush in that work. So you talked about drawing after the casts, the classic busts and casts and sculptures at the National Gallery School. And you shot through that in about 6 months, not the normal 12.
Exactly, yeah.
So that must tell me that drawing was something that sort of you took to very quickly.
Well, I took to it quickly after I got instruction from Dagi because he was a master of tone, and I'd been using pencil in a shady sort of way, shading, and he would point out a whole area that was literally the same tone, so you just treat that as an area of tone. Yeah. Once I cottoned onto that, I was up and running, and the cast room became a very interesting area of exploring it.
You talked about returning to portraiture late in life when you were asked to do some commissions for universities, to sing VCs and so on. The way you spoke about that was that portraiture for you was a very almost workmanlike process, and that you were really returning to the lessons that you learnt directly from Dagi decades before.
Exactly.
Did all that flow back? Because it's not something you'd really worked on in the intervening years.
Yeah, it did. Of course it flowed back. You don't go through 4 years at art school learning all that sort of stuff and forget it.
Yeah.
But I never treated it as serious art.
Right.
You probably heard what I was saying.
Notwithstanding that he would have treated it as serious art, I imagine. Dagi himself.
Well, he would, but that was his whole life.
Yeah.
And he was very good at it.
Yeah.
He was a marvellous teacher, by the way.
Yeah.
Purely on the strength of teaching us about tone. And he taught us how to use colour in a tonal sense. Right. And that became a vocabulary. Yeah. And with that vocabulary, you could paint anything. Yeah. Absolutely anything you wanted. Yeah. It goes back, way back to Velázquez and on through Monet and so on. Yeah. And Meldrum and then Dagi. Yeah. And it's a fundamental basis of good painting. There's very few really good paintings I've seen that don't have that underlying strong sense of tone.
For that Meldrum School, it was very much Velázquez was the great master really of all time, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
In terms of organising figures in space and so on through the sheer application and organisation of tone.
But although Dagi gave us the vocabulary to do anything we wanted, we went on not to be like Dagi, actually.
No, you really weren't. So you mentioned that very fondly, I thought, that Hesse was very kind and that you drive up at the end of a painting session or drawing session on the weekend and he'd critique the work. So he was a mentor to you in every sense. Did you go on to, as it were, do the same for others through your career? Is that something you've done?
Not really. I think I might be too selfish for that, I don't know, but I was not as generous as he.
Right.
He wrote long 3-page letters to me and things about, not just about commenting on my work, but about what he was doing, where he was going. Wow. He had a son who lived down south and he was going down to paint down there for a while. Yeah. All that sort of stuff. Yeah. He was incredibly generous. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure that I had the time or the inclination. It's a selfish attitude. Yeah. I never thought about it like being a mentor to somebody. Yeah. People would come up, young people would come up to the farm up in the Glasshouse Mountains, and they'd watch me do drawings and things like that, and they picked up on bits and pieces like that.
Did that happen with Whiteley, or did it go the other way?
No, it went the other way with Whiteley. Whiteley used to come up regularly and draw, particularly draw. He did do one painting early on, but it was too wet to take back in his car. He came up about 3 weeks later in a zippy little sports car, but the painting wouldn't fit in the boot, so he got a saw and sawed 2 inches off the edge of the masonite or whatever. Yeah.
And I hope you kept it. No, sorry.
Actually, I didn't. Yeah. But I watched him draw. Yeah. And I learned a great deal from watching him draw. Yeah. He used to draw, well, with all sorts of things, but what fascinated me was the way he used to draw with a very fine brush. Right. The outline, and then scrub in with a big coarse brush and so on. Yeah. He had a strong influence on my drawing at that time. Right. I did a swag of them around the place.
Just thinking about the way that an artist builds their work, I thought about the way a novelist builds a book. It goes through interminable drafts. sub-edits and edits all the way through before finally they hand their manuscript over to an editor. Now, it doesn't work like that for a visual artist who works, well, like the novelist, you might begin making the work in a very solitary way, but ultimately, when it leaves that studio to enter the world, it leaves it in precisely the state that you left it. When the truck backs up to take it to the framers or to the next exhibition. How do you get to the place where you feel a painting is finished, particularly a big, ambitious work that you almost could just relentlessly return to?
Yeah, well, it can be difficult, but when you've been doing it for a while, you know when you reach the point.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. Not in my case. I mean, I know when I finish a painting. I'd never come back and twiddle around with it again.
Now, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
How do you know you've arrived at that point?
Everything in the painting seems to be in the right place,
Right.
the right colour. It feels
Resolved.
there's a rightness about it
Yeah.
that I wouldn't want it any other way.
Yeah.
I mean, Piero del Francesco's a master of placing a figure in a painting in a way that could never be any other way, or a colour and things like that. But I'll tell you an example. Laurie Thomas put on an exhibition, a small one, of Fairweather's work in the art gallery a long time ago.
Yeah.
And they got Fairweather down for it. And they walked around Fairweather. They were all Fairweather paintings.
Yeah.
And they walked Fairweather around. And Fairweather said, "Oh, that's mine. That's not mine. That's not mine. That's mine." Purely because the thing you were talking about. They arrived down and they were damaged a bit, so they sent off to the restorer. And when Fairweather finished the painting, it was beautiful. It's deeply satisfying. In fact, 5 of them, I think, he put a special little signature on, which meant auspicious day, beautiful day.
Yeah.
Only 5
a
of them.
monogram.
Exactly. And he felt that about all his paintings. And most painters know when they reach the end of the painting.
Yeah.
They feel the rightness about it.
Yeah. You referred in the interview to a quote from that great German poet and writer Hermann Hesse, who clearly had a very profound and lasting impact on you. And just to reprise that, the true profession of a man, Hesse said, is to find his way to himself. So be true to yourself, he seems to be saying, and you will truly know the world and it will know you. What is it about that statement that resonated so deeply with you as a young man? And what do you think it was asking of you then? And what does it mean to you now?
I think it was asking me then not to clutter things up too much, simplify it down. Let's see. To find out what was essentially me.
Yeah.
It wasn't what the world thought of me or anything.
No.
It's just what I could unravel in me by whatever I was thinking, reading, painting.
Yeah. So if it's not you on the canvas,
No.
it's not good work. It's not work that you'd ever feel satisfied with.
Well, eventually it's you and your attitude on the canvas
Yeah.
all the time. That's why there's some rather odd stuff floating around there. But that statement still lingers today. I love it. And I think we all should actually be trying to identify with that.
Yeah. Well, we've heard quite a lot about your interest in Jungian philosophy, which you discovered in the 30s, and this notion of the collective unconscious and the archetype, which was spoken about in the video. Probably one of the things that, for those that are less familiar with Jung, is perhaps to understand it as something that images are like composites of memories. They're multiple memories combined together, and that the imagery, when it's produced, almost feels unpremeditated. It seems to just appear. And you said that quite specifically about the mandala in that first painting. So from that first moment of apprehension about Jung and Jungian philosophy and theory, Jung seems to have lodged himself very deeply in the way that you construct your work, because so much of what you do almost seems to appear on the canvas as if from your unconscious. Is that something you feel when you're making a painting?
Sometimes you get urged, it comes, I have no idea where it comes from. You see something or experience something, and you think I could unravel that in some visual form. And there have been a number of series of art subjects, like the domestic violence thing and so on. And probably, and the night sea journey work, which came out of nowhere. I don't know where that came from. But what I literally call below the navel, not out of the head. And there was Cain in the Promised Land, which was probably the most serious sequence of work that I did in early 80s. And it's triggered by a simple thing, Cain, you know, slaying Abel. One man, brother slaying brother. And at the same time, around the world, tribes were killing tribes, escalating out. And that's when it sort of settled in me that I didn't like the state of the world very much. It was a real mess. And I still think it is. But, and a lot of that appeared in some of the paintings. There was an underlying anxiety, an underlying menace, and so on. And that comes out of nowhere. I mean, somewhere, but and totally unconscious.
I was struck in the longer form version of the video. You spoke on the video that we saw tonight about the mandala being a kind of breakthrough work for you. And in another part of the film that wasn't in the version we looked at tonight, you talked about the Night Sea Journey series as being another one of those. So I'm just putting to you that breakthrough could mean a shift in compositional structure, the exploration of some new iconographic interest, or simply a way through a long-standing pictorial problem that you've finally cracked. Can you reflect a little on what that word breakthrough means to you when you're thinking about them?
It's a little bit of the three things you just mentioned, but it's certainly breaking new ground in terms of the imagery in a way that I've never thought of images like that. And it is part of the unfolding psyche of me, I suppose. I think that's it.
It's interesting you use that term, because talking about your life now as being more filled with peace than it might have been 30 or 40 years ago, I think that really comes through in the most recent work that you've shown with Philip in the last few years.
Oh, it does, certainly. The Waterloo exhibition.
Exactly.
And more recently, the Golden Landscapes. Triggered by the Turner show.
I love your late Turner story.
Show.
I think late Daws is going to be very productive. There we are, Exhibit A. Well, not quite, it's not that late.
But, but we'll see. I mean, I have a feeling that there's not going to be a lot of menace in any
I think the
paintings
menace
that come out. Literally,
dissipated.
that last one, the Trojan horse, is probably the last painting with a fair bit of threat in it. But I'm getting to a point where I like the tranquility of water lilies, golden landscapes and so on, and the mountains.
Well, I know that you love the mountains in Tuscany and Umbria, and I'm thinking of cities like Arezzo and San Sepolcro and Assisi, where you've been. I think probably many of us have been to look at the works of Piero, and the wonderful thing about doing that is you go to the town hall in San Sepolcro and you see the resurrection on the wall, unmoved, since the day that it was complete. And the landscape behind the figure of Christ and the four figures at the base of the tomb is the landscape right outside the door. And you talked about that love of the mountain, painting the mountain, particularly in regard to living at Owl Creek overlooking the Glasshouse Mountains. I'm interested to understand, for you, does it feel that almost weird and exotic landscape of Glasshouse, in which all these kind of geological formations seem to rear up out of the earth in this, unearthly way, compared to that highly organised, civilised, brilliantly rational seeming landscape of Tuscany. Is there something about the landscape that he lived in that made him quintessentially the artist that he is, and something about the landscape you've lived in that's made you who you are as an artist?
Well, I've always loved Piero. As an art student, just out of art school days, I was using the golden mean and all that sort of thing, dividing rectangles in the perfect way and so on. But in the Glasshouse Mountains, all the farmers burn off.
Yeah.
They're all pyromaniacs, They just drop matches to burn off all the undergrowth.
Yeah.
It's a sensible thing to do.
Bushfire season.
But it means that for a month or more, you've got this, this smoky haze.
Yeah.
And you get that pale Piero della Francesco landscape.
Yeah.
And that was the common denominator, I think, for me anyway. But there are bits of landscape, not unlike the Glasshouse Mountains, in, say, the Nativity. You look at one side of it, there's a beautiful piece of landscape, very similar to the mountains. So there wasn't that much difference.
A very distinct and beautiful blue in the Nativity, isn't it? And a very similar blue in, I think it's the Baptism of Christ. I'm just thinking there's a couple of paintings in which that blue it's perfect, isn't it?
Yeah, not just the blue in the baptism. You can't imagine the figure or the tree or anything being in any other position.
Yeah.
There's a stillness about it, almost like something quite divine informing the painting.
I think it's less that he made the landscape and more that the landscape made him as a painter. And I actually feel similarly about the great love that you've had for, the North Coast landscape that just sits above us. It very much feels that the spirit of your work is right inside that landscape when you drive through it.
Well, I like to think there's a bit of it there.
Yeah.
But Piero had it at his doorstep.
Yeah.
His material.
Yeah. Well, it's not a bad benchmark. I think we can agree on that. Look, it's time, I think, to invite, if there are some, I hope there are some questions from the audience. There is a roving mic just up on the right-hand side. Anyone have any questions for Lawrence? There must be. I can see a hand at the back.
Could you speak to your process? The thing that's for many years fascinated me about your work is that life that you have underneath your paintings through that undercolour, but that seems so integral to the mystery and atmosphere in the paintings. So just could you speak to the process?
The process of painting them, you mean?
Yeah, the process of painting them, specifically with your use of undercolour and your layering.
Okay. Well, this is going to set the stage for people to forge them, but okay. Once I've solved the problem of the composition and the colour and everything on the computer now, I do a detailed drawing on the canvas, and then I rub very thinly a layer of burnt umber over the whole thing. And then I get cardboard or something and scrape out where I want lighter patches to be and so on. And that reveals the general core structure of what the painting's going to be. And when that's dry, I start scumbling veils of colour over the top of that. Some thicker, some thinner, and build up the picture that way. And you get a fairly luminous effect because of that. Now, I hope we're not going to see thousands of paintings with burnt umber bases. And anyway, does that answer your question, though?
Yes, thank you. Are there any others? Oh.
Lawrence, thank you for the presentation tonight. I'm owner of a number of your works, and back in the 90s I met socially a woman who was putting together her PhD dissertation about the link between creativity and trauma, and perhaps the shamanistic traditions and what the role of the shaman was. And I found that very fascinating. She said that, I can't remember the dear woman's name, but she did indicate that she had visited you and you'd spoken to her about some of those themes in your own work. Do you recall that at all?
No, I don't actually.
I was fearful you might not. So
No, the word shaman, I don't understand that word.
well, the shaman is a...
Oh, I understand what shaman is, but I can't imagine using that. Well, somebody used it from me.
well, this was the topic of her dissertation.
Yeah.
And she was looking at a series, you know, where is the font of creativity? Where does it come from? What inspires people to be creative? And the theme that I found interesting was how you could translate a traumatic event in your life into a piece of art. Mm-hmm. But if you can't recall it, it's unfair of me to raise it in such a random way, and I don't mean to be disturbing, but I thought you might have had a memory of that.
No.
Thank you.
Other hands in the air? No? All right. Well, it looks like we've come to a close.
Close indeed.
Look, it's been very generous of Lawrence to give his time to be here, partly, of course, for the screening, but also to participate in this conversation, and I've enjoyed it very much. And I think all of us have learned a great deal more about your work and its background, both from the video and hopefully too from the discussion. So thank you so much. We have if you could all please join me again. Thank you, and thank you. Right. Now, I have the humble duty now of inviting Lawrence to select the Lucky Door Prize, so brace yourselves, Lawrence. You'd be so good.
I'm not looking.
There we are.
Is that this one?
There's two there. Now you've got one.
Is that one?
Yep, that's
Okay.
one.
That's it.
That's it. That's the lucky one.
Can I read it out?
Yes.
Red Sea 87.
Any squeal of delight somewhere?
I've got there we are.
Oh, there we are. Wonderful. Thank you. So I've just been... there's only one, I take it, prize. I see two bags. Is there another prize? Oh, goodness me, Lawrence, this is exhausting.
There'll be
but we're going to have to...
every one of those.
We'll press upon you again if you could draw another.
Okay. Here we go. Is that just one? Is that just one?
Yes, that's one.
Okay. Right. Still, Red Sea 77.
Oh, there we are. No, we have a winner. No. Oh,
Yes.
there we are, second row.
Well done.
Wonderful. Well, look, while our nerves are settling from the excitement of the door prize, just to mention that there's another of these events in the same series being presented in April. I don't have an exact date, but you'll be, I'm sure, advised of that early next year with Sebastian Demoro. So that's another one to look forward to. So finally, thank you to Vicky, thank you to James, thank you to everyone for being a very warm and generous audience, and importantly, thank you to Lawrence for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.